replacing conflict with compassion. Despite what some may say, anger can be useful and sometimes necessary, providing no one gets hurt in the process. Anger is actually a secondary emotion, with its roots based within primary emotions such as sadness or fear. And once established, it needs to flow in an appropriate way. It's a pressure cooker that requires releasing. It sometimes appears to be destructive when situations break down, but like the phoenix from the ashes, it makes room for fresh situations to emerge. So anger, although not always preferable, is not entirely a bad thing. But the stress and anger to which I now refer is the emotion that pops up all too often over things that, when reduced to their constituent parts, actually have very little to do with you or the subject matter that triggered the flare-up. Anger and stress should not be a regular occurrence in your life. Okay, so at this point it is worth mentioning that if your anger stems from somewhere obvious, like one or a blend of the three elements of trauma, abandonment, rejection or abuse, then it is important to have these emotions dealt with by someone who is trained to help you. Find the avenue that feels right for you. Fear of facing these emotions can be the biggest hurdle, as we've learned to become diversionary masters. If anger or anxiety is ever present in your life, then it's time for the new you to take some tentative steps and come face to face with these emotions. For every new day, there is a new you. It takes power to do this, but so much more powerful is what you will eventually become. But what about those times when the roots of anger is less obvious? The perceived pressures of life can be unbearable at times, and the fear of losing control over these situations is ever present. At times we can appear to be perpetually overwhelmed. When you think about it rationally, the fact remains that whether you have excessively stressed over a situation or not will not positively change an outcome at all. On the contrary, it's likely to have compounded the issue. So why is it that we've managed to create a negative emotional attachment to so many things? Allow one negative thought to bed in, and you'll notice how it's an open invitation for just about every other dark and twisty thought to pile on. It's how it works. Like attracts like. It all becomes a little overwhelming, and you'll find it impossible to be constructive during these times. The fact that you're beginning to feel a negative emotion should be a warning that you need to address or acknowledge the reason for its existence, and then realign to your natural calmer state. We should always try to avoid making decisions during times of extreme emotions, as the results will almost inevitably reflect the imbalance of the moment. These emotions come from within you. It's not something thrust upon you. And as much as this may be uncomfortable for some to hear, it's not something that somebody else is responsible for. Your emotions and your thoughts and deeds are in your power and yours alone. So where do these powerful and sometimes disruptive emotions come from? It helps if we start looking at each end of the emotional spectrum. One side is positive and the other one negative. Which emotion would you place at either end? Many people think the opposite to love is hate, but actually it's fear. Love and fear. It is actually fear that gives rise to the darker emotions. Again, these fear-based emotions are not necessarily bad. Sometimes they serve you in an appropriate way when an immediate response is required. It's the emotion that will spring you out of bed when you hear a noise downstairs because you want to protect your family. These necessary and useful emotions need to be understood, but we can generally process them there and then if the source is obvious. But sometimes it's not so obvious, and we love a bit of fear. Not just about our own lives, but even more so within society, whether it's disease, terrorism, war, politics, interest rates. The list goes on. all perpetuated and magnified by our media and finger-pointing politicians keen to save us from impending doom. It sells papers, and we keep on reading them, and it keeps us thinking we need help from the very systems that give us more and more to be fearful about. Artificial fear within our cultural day-to-day living is, ironically, created for the most part by those who seek some sort of control. Control over others is only sought by those who fear losing it. It really isn't their fault either. We have wholeheartedly bought into the fear game. And it primarily functions like most things do, through supply and demand. However, the emotionally driven herd mentality of our society leaves plenty of wiggle room for the greedy. And we need not look too far to find evidence of greed in just about every single service-related aspect of life. Fear was practically a way of life throughout history. It was the standard of the ruling classes for many thousands of years, so we can't be too hard on ourselves. But we now live in very different times, and it has no place in today's world, as it has done in the past, and yet there's still plenty of it around. But only if you buy into it. One way to truly understand fear is to study it, trace it back to its root origin, and discover whether it was formed organically, or whether it was fed to us by an artificial construct of an external source. It's not a case of ignoring it, but rather remain educated. Just limit the amount of energy and investment you give it, especially if it was never really in your path to start with. Generalized fear should have no place in our lives, and it serves no purpose bar creating segregation and yet more fearful situations. You may have heard the old Indian story of the granddad explaining about life to his grandchild. The Cherokee explained about the two wolves, one called fear and hate, and the other called love and compassion, and they're about to have a fight to the death. And the young boy asks, "So which one wins the fight?" And the grandfather answered, "The one you feed the most." When it comes to actually being in a challenging situation that deserves your utmost attention, the fear releases adrenaline and endorphins that is designed to keep you on your toes and prompt you into taking action. Fight or flight. You're effectively channeling that energy into a more focused outcome. Be the one in charge and in control of the energy that it generates by trusting your feelings and focusing on all possible solutions. If this cannot be achieved in the moment via interpreting the emotional feedback you get, then it's time to shift your focus and find a way of distracting yourself to stop the unnecessary waves of stress. So zip it up. Move on until there's another suitable moment for you to receive the necessary brainwave idea or assistance that solves the problem. So for the moment, perhaps it's time to relax. But for some that's easier said than done. In what ways can we recalibrate our emotional equilibrium after a bout of anger? Well, first you'll need to let the high emotions pass to find a base level to function from. From that point, it entirely depends on you and how open-minded you're prepared to be. There's always a way if you set the intentions to find one. Sometimes forcing the mood can have an effect if it's done with a little authenticity. Fake it until you make it. The worldwide success of yoga laughter classes can seem bizarre to the casual observer, but the act of forcing a laugh can have profound effect. The starting point for this activity immediately takes you out of your comfort zone and into a strange new perspective, and it can very quickly turn into unstoppable hysterics. Those wonderful healing endorphins are then able to flow throughout your body, and it's not a bad way to kickstart a new mood. It's not for everyone, admittedly, but it's worth thinking about a strategy to employ when you're feeling down, as solutions can be hard to come by when your mind is closed with negative thought patterns. Pilots will often say they feel so much more relaxed in the air than they do on the ground. There's a psychological shift in knowing that all your earthly troubles are suddenly inaccessible. They quite literally are able to rise above the situation and have an overview without the emotional clutter. What a great time to think about life's little conundrums. Of course, not all of us have planes at our disposal, but in concept, we also need to find this safe space from which to plan and make our decisions, effectively recalibrate our minds. The more you spend time practicing your methods of maintaining a balanced frame of mind, the more natural it will become. It is either a conscious choice to be positive or the unconscious loop of a Groundhog Day. If we are not in control of our emotions, then it won't be long before our emotions gain control of us. Remaining calm in the face of other people's anger is also another huge accomplishment. Perhaps the first thing the old you would want to do is show them who's right and let them know who's boss. You can be sure a little self-righteous indignation will add some high-octane fuels onto an already explosive situation. Proving you are right to someone who is already in a high state of anxiety doesn't fix anything, especially when their version of right and sense of injustice is probably what started the scene in the first place. Their mind balance and judgment may be well off kilter. So is this really a time for justice, or will it make it worse? But what harm would it do if we just took a moment to build their trust instead? Perhaps if we decided to use a little compassion and listen to what they have to say, it may have a profoundly different outcome, even when you're sure they're wrong or behaved unreasonably. People get upset and angry when they feel they're not being listened to or taken seriously, and sometimes a little understanding is all it takes. It's a test of your own stability and self-confidence to diffuse a situation that is simply an extension of someone else's fears. It takes a little self-control to take a moment and understand the bigger picture, rather than listening to simply respond. These moments of de-escalated calm after a potential event can be positively empowering for everyone concerned. No one needs to look like a fool, and they're more likely to reflect on their own unreasonable behaviours if it's met in the moment with a compassionate response from you. However, if you do react with anger, they are immediately justified, well, in their heads, to continue in this vein. Watch it flare up. Again, this takes discipline, but once you've had the opportunity to express this control in practice, you'll then become a proud master of diffusion. Litter droppers, aggressive driving, bad language, and a general lack of common courtesy are all classic triggering points. But you know these are just the behaviours of people who function unconsciously and are being led by their ego minds. You may think that picking up that little bit of litter and dropping it in the bin is a demeaning and menial task. Why should I? It's not mine. Firstly, because the new you isn't bothered by such trivia. And not only do we prefer to have a cleaner street, it's much more important to set that example. Make it into a thing to be proud and considerate. Take the opportunity to send this powerful message to anyone watching that life is okay. It's just a bit of litter. We already know that there are folk out there who struggle to behave in an acceptable way. Let's stop being overly surprised when we see evidence of it. This simple, stress-free strategy allows life's many irritating but essentially insignificant situations to fall away. No one is infallible to the irritations of others, but if we can try to filter out 90% or more of other people's nonsense out, then maintaining a positive outlook becomes easier. As the Chinese proverb said, tension is who you think you should be. Relaxation is who you are.